It is a hadron on the Rambam and a siyum of Maseches Ksubos. And this morning we're marking the yahrzeit of Jane Marcus's Zayde Reb Mordechai ben Tzvi. It should be an aliyah for his neshama. We are delighted to say Mazel Tov to Yehudis, who mixing that up. Yehudis's Einakol has a birthday tomorrow, Chai Nisan. His name is Levi Yitzchak ben Shalom Doivber. And Mazel Tov to Rachi, whose new grandson is having his bris milah right now, and to Zisi Raskin, who has a new granddaughter born to her daughter Shana and her husband Avi Rappaport. And with your permission, I want to dedicate our learning today to Mora Nyman, who was an iconic teacher in Beis Rivka High School, I think, for over 4 decades. And she taught Nevi'im, she taught Yirmiyahu, she taught Yeshayahu, and a lot of the psukim that are mentioned today, I can just visualize her and I can hear her teaching us those psukim. So I wanted to dedicate this class with great love and gratitude to Mora Nyman of Beis Rivka. Here we go. This is a lengthy sikha, just telling you to get comfortable. And we're going to go along for the ride here. Okay. The sikha was said in Parshat Bechukosai. It references a pasuk in Parshat Bechukosai, but it's connected to Pesach because it talks about Achres Hayamim. It talks about the times of Mashiach. It talks about what the Rambam teaches about the times of Mashiach and how that can be reconciled with other teachings about the time of Mashiach. And of course, we know that we're now in the days preceding Shvi Shel Pesach and Achron Shel Pesach that is all about Yemais HaMashiach, and as Hashem, we should be zeicha that it shouldn't be about, it should be Yemais HaMashiach. Aleph. Kasav HaRambam Beperek Hasiyum DeHilchas Malachim. The Rambam writes in the last perek of Hilchas Malachim, Al Yala Al Alev. It shouldn't even arise to your heart. Should be Yemais HaMashiach Yibatel Davar Miminhagei Shel Olam. That things are going to be different than they are, and the norm is in the world today. Don't even go in that direction. Or that things are going to be different than they were originally during the time of creation. Ella, olam kiminhagei noheg. But rather, the world will continue in the way that it has until now. Kiminhagei noheg, as is the custom of how the world, chugs along. V'zeh shenemar b'Yeshayahu, and regarding what it says in Yeshayahu, v'gor ze'ev im keves, that a wolf will be able to lie down with a lamb. Mashal b'chida chulei. This is a metaphor. It's an allegory. It's a riddle. Shiyu Yisrael yoshvin lebetach im rishoi akum. That Bnei Yisrael will be able to live in peace with the evil nations of the world that serve idols. Hamishulim k'ze'ev v'nemar, and those nations are compared to wolves and to leopards. Shenemar, as it says, and this is from Yirmiyahu, ze'ev aravais yeshadadim. The wolf of the desert robs them. V'yachzru l'dasa emes. So the Rambam says, but they will return to proper belief. V'lo yigazlu v'lo yashchisu, and they will not plunder and they will not destroy. Ela yochlu davar hamutar, but rather they will eat what is permitted. Shenemar, as it says, and this is from Yeshayahu, v'arye kibakar yochal teven, that the lion, like the cows, will eat straw. In other words, they will not be predators anymore. V'chein kol kiyetze be'elu hadvarim b'inyan Mashiach he mishalim. And the Rambam says, and so on and so forth. All of these various scriptures from prophecies, they're all allegory, they're all metaphor. And in the days of the King Mashiach, Yivada L'chol, it will become clear to all, it will be known to all, La'eza Davar Hayamashal, Uma Inin Ramzu Behen, what this was an allegory for, and what was being alluded to through these prophecies. Ubehemshach Dvarav, and he continues, Amru Chachamim, the Chachamim said, Ein bein, there's no difference between now and Yemais Mashiach, Ella Shibud Malchis. The Rebbe is going to speak going to reference that at length, that the Chachamim said that the only difference between now and the time of Mashiach is that now we're subservient to other forces, to other Malchis, to other sovereigns. And when Mashiach comes, that will no longer be the case. We will have our freedom from the sovereignty of other nations. Okay. Achas mehastiras ladas harambam anal. So one of the things that contradicts what the Rambam opines, as said above, Shabi Mois HaMashiach lo yivatel davar miminhaga shel olam chulei ela olam kiminhagay noyeg, that the Rambam opines that when Mashiach comes, nothing is going to change. The natural world will continue as it does today, as it always has. So one of the contradictions to this, Matzinu l'chayr b'maimar ha'Torah's kohanim, b'parshasenu ala pasuk ve'etz hasada yitem period. Seemingly, there's a contradiction in the Medrash on a pasuk in Bechukosai that says, "And the tree of the field will give forth its fruits." And Torah's kohanim, which is the Medrash on Vayikra, says, "Uminayin sha'af ilane srak asidim lios oisim peres." From where do we learn that even the barren trees will, in times of Mashiach, give fruit? Talmud Leimar, ve'etz hasada yitim period. The Torah teaches this from the pasuk in Bechukosai that the tree of the field will give its fruit. That's one contradiction. The Rebbe says, "Val derech zeh isa b'seif meseches ksubos," and we also find a contradiction that's similar at the end of ksubos. Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi, Amar Rav, Asidin kol ilone srak shebe'eretz Yisrael sheyit anu peres. That in the future, all the barren trees in Eretz Yisrael will bear fruit. Shen ne'amar, like it says, ke'etz nasa pirye te'ena v'gefen nasnu chelam. As it says in the Navi Yoel, that the tree will bear fruit, and the fig trees and the grapevine will give forth their strength. And so barren trees giving fruit is a repudiation of the natural course. So how could the Rambam say that everything will be olam kiminhagay nohig, everything will just go along naturally as it is now? Base. Okay, so that the Rebbe starts out with this, with setting up this contradiction, that the Rambam maintains that there will be no changes to the natural order, and that we have sources that contradict this. Base. L'chayra haya efshar liyashiv. Seemingly, perhaps, this can be reconciled in the following way. Shaladas harambam gama mari chazal hanal himashal v'chida. That Rambam understands even the Maimari Chazal that were quoted at the end of Seif Aleph, that they are also allegorical. For instance, Eitz Machal, you could say that the whole idea of fruit-bearing trees, Mayral Talmidei Chachamim, that this is an allegory for Torah scholars. V'lo nisrak elu am ha'aretz, and barren trees are a metaphor for unlearned folk. Ula'asid lava yetziu gam ilo nisrak am ha'aretz peres. And when Mashiach comes, even the unlearned folk will also give forth fruit. They Talmidei Chachamim, Hainu, sheyu Talmidei Chachamim, oy perish achar ki yetz b'zeh, Or there are other ways in which you could interpret what the Chazal say in a way that is not going to be a stira, it's not going to be a contradiction to what the Rambam opines. But the Rebbe immediately obviates this way of thinking. He says about he says, but it's not possible to put forth this explanation why. Ki b'nois of l'kach shebechlal kosher loymar al divrei tanoim v'amaroim shehem mashal bilvad, masha ein kein divrei hanavim. The Rebbe says, in addition to the fact that generally we do not relate to what the Chachamim said in the Gemara like we do to the words of Nevi'im and certain Psukim in Torah, those could be understood as Mishalim. Those could be understood as allegory. But we never saw that we should understand the words of Chazal as allegory. But the Rebbe says, but on top of this, Hari benidin didan kosher biyoser loymar kein. He says, but in this particular case, it's very hard pressed to say that this is meant to be an allegory. Why? Sharei hamaymer hanal b'teres kahanim ba behemshech lekama brachos sheteichnon brachos gashmius dafka, because this teaching from the Medrash comes in within the context of blessings that are stated, and the blessings are material, they are corporeal, they're physical. Including the blessing that is inherent in the verse that the earth will give forth its produce and the tree of the field will give its fruits. Where the Teres Kahanim says, and it's not going to be like it is now. Ella but it's going to be like it was in the times of Adam HaRishon, before Chet Eitz Hadas, where you sowed, you planted, and within a day you could reap the fruit. Natua va'isa peres ben yoma. You would plant it, and then ben yoma, within 24 hours you had the fruit. Ha'etz nechal, you could eat the tree. V'hainu. Shahabracha hi kipshuta begashmias mamish. So all the other brachas that are in this portion of the Medrash, literal. So how are you going to say that this particular one, that the barren fruit will give forth fruit, that's just an allegory that, that Amei Haaretz will become like Talmidei Chachamim? And the Rebbe says, "Val derech ze b'ksuvos huva mimrei zu behemshach lekama maimorim hamisparshim kipshutam behechrach." The Rebbe says, and the same thing in Ksubos, where we had a similar teaching. There also it comes within a larger context, and all of the things delineated there are all we must in literally. Ula dugma, for instance, as an example, Rabbi Chanina Misakein Maskle Ule Kategoria Betalmidei Chachamim, that Rabbi Chanina would fix any stumbling blocks, and that accusations will be brought against Talmidei Chachamim, meaning that they're going to be forced to continue to refine their arguments because people are going to bring kind of antithesis to what they set forth. They'll challenge their conclusions. And if so, mistaber shegam perish maimer zeh asidin kolilon israk chulei hu kipshutei. So if we're going to learn everything else that it says in Ksubos kipshutei, factually, literally, then how are you going to just cherry pick this one about the barren trees and you're going to say that's just an allegory? That's not actually that barren trees are going to be fruit-bearing trees in times of Mashiach, but rather that unlearned people will become like Talmidei Chachamim. Rabbi says it's, first of all, we don't do that bechlal with words of Chazal. We understand them to be literal unless they tell us it's an allegory. And second, if you look at the context, both in the Medrash and in the Gemara, you're hard-pressed to say that this particular thing should be taken as an allegory. Which brings us back to our original problem, which is how could the Rambam maintain that everything is going to continue along the same way that it is now, naturally, when we have these opinions that state that things are going to be very different when Mashiach comes. Gimel. Vihine al divrei harambam hanal, and regarding this teaching of the Rambam, that olam kimin hagay noihik, that the world is just going to comport itself as it does now, heisik haravid, the Ravid questions, or the Ravid challenges the Rambam, mea pasuk b'parshasenu, from another pasuk in Parshas Bechukosai, v'hishbati chaya ra min haaretz. The Torah says, and I will completely banish wild animals from the earth. And the Ravid says, again, this has to be understood literally. So again, this seems to be different than what the Rambam is describing, because right now in our world, there are animals that are animals of prey, that are predators, that are scary, that are dangerous. The Haradbaz alasar. So the Radbaz over there on that challenge to the Rambam, Yeshev Hasagas Haravid. So he seeks to reconcile the Ravid's challenge to the Rambam. And he says like this: the Ein Zu Hasaga, that this is not an actual challenge against the Rambam. Why? Kashem Shasharak Sovim Mashal Gamze Mashal. Just like there are many other psukim that are a mashal, so is this one. Umamshech, and he continues, Aval masharoi lahamim bazeh shadvarim hein gam kipshutam be'eretz Yisrael. Okay, so the Radbaz comes and he says, they're both right. The Rambam is right that olam kimin hagay nohig. The Mashiach comes, everything's going to continue as it is now, and the Ravid is right. Why? Because you could understand all these psukim to be a mashal, generally speaking. However, they have to be taken literally when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, different from the rest of the world. Eretz Yisrael would be an exception. Chidisiv, as it says, lo yerou v'lo yashchisu b'chol har kachi ki mala aretz deas Hashem haaretz hayidua. And he brings down this very, very famous pasuk that the Rebbe never tired from citing, that the Rambam brings at the very end of his Hilchas Mashiach, that the earth, haaretz, but the way the Radbaz explains it is the Aretz Hayidua, not the world, but Eretz Yisrael will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem, like waters cover the seabed, and there will be no evil, and there'll be no destroyers in my holy mountain. Meaning that v'chein v'ishbati chayira min aretz. So the pasuk, and I will banish all evil and wild animals from the land, but is about Eretz Yisrael. Aval b'shar arotzes olam kimin hagei noyik. But when it comes, I'm sorry, I read it wrong. Aval b'shar arotzes, but in the rest of the lands, olam kimin hagei noyik, the world will continue in exactly the way it is now. V'aksuvim he mashal shechein chasuv lo yisa goyel goy cherev lo yilmedu eid milchama u'be'eretz Yisrael yiskayim hapshat v'hamashal. So he says, in the rest of the world, not Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be just like it is today, and all the psukim about the time of Mashiach have to be understood as allegory, just like it says that no nation will do war with other nations, and they won't pick up swords. But in Eretz Yisrael, it will be literal. It will be understood literally. It will come to fruition literally, and also on the allegoric level. So if you're going to take this explanation, we might say, so the Rebbe says, if you're going to go with the way that the Radbaz is trying to reconcile the Rambam and the Ravid, then the Rebbe says, actually, you could say that this depends on the difference between the Maimori Chazal that the Rebbe cited about the barren trees. And now the Rebbe parses both of those texts. Big Gemara Isa says in the Gemara Ksubas it says Ilone Srakshe be'Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara says it's talking about barren trees that are in Eretz Yisrael. Masha Enkin, in contradistinction between Kahanim and the Medrash Nemar Ilone Srak Stam. It just says barren trees without qualifying that it's those that are in Eretz Yisrael. Omi pashtus halosha mashma shahanidun ene rak ilani srak shebe'eretz Yisrael, ella ilani srak shebechol ha'olam kulei. And from the fact that the Medrash doesn't qualify, it means that this refers to all barren trees wherever they may be found. V'achiluk b'neihem. And so what's the difference? L'fi ataris kahanim yelas lovei shinu b'minhagei shalaylam. So then it comes out that based on the Medrash, there actually will be a difference, Lasan Lave, from what it is today. It's going to be Shinoi b'minhagei shalaylam, from the way that the world acts today. Aval lefi haGemara lo yeh shinoi b'minhagei shalaylam ba'olam b'chlal b'chutz la'aretz v'rak be'eretz Yisrael tiyeh hanhaga miyuchedes. It comes out that according to the Gemara, the difference between today and when Mashiach comes is only going to manifest in Eretz HaKodesh, in Eretz Yisrael. V'Ravid nokat keshitas ataris kahanim, and the Ravid embraced the understanding of the Medrash. Asher ilane srak stam asidim lios oisim peres, that all barren trees will in the future give forth fruit. And if you embrace that opinion, then it means that the world is going to be different than it is today. And this is also the source for his objection to the Rambam from another pasuk in Bechukosai, where the Torah says, "And I will banish all wild animals from the land." That, and he says that this should be understood literally. You might have been able to say that this too is a metaphor, but no, he discounts that. Why? Ki midrashas ataris kahanim al pasuk Rabbi Yehuda Omer ma'avir mina olam, because he drills down at what the Medrash says further. The Rabbi Yehuda says that ma'avir mina olam, that the wild animals will be banished from the entire world. Reb Shimon Omer mashbisan shelo yazikun. And Reb Shimon said, no, destroying means they will be transformed banishment means they will be transformed so that they will not be harmful. Ubefrat, sheshinu kan miloshen pasuk mina aretz va'amru mina olam muchach shepeirusho kipshutei. And especially pay attention to the fact that in the pasuk it says that they will be banished min ha'aretz, from the land, but in the Medrash it says min ha'olam, from the entire world, which means that literally wild animals will no longer exist. That's according to the Mefarshim that say that there's going to be changes in the world. The sources that say there's going to be changes in the world. Masha Enkein Harambam, but not so with the Rambam. The Rambam nakat lefi das haradbaz keloshon Gemara. The Rambam embraced the lashon of the Gemara. Shadvarim amurim rak binageli lone srak shebe'eretz Yisrael. That when it says that barren trees will give forth fruit, this is talking just about the barren trees in Eretz Yisrael. Va'al kein ra'u lahamin shadvarim himgam kipshutam be'eretz Yisrael, aval b'shar arotzes olam kiminhagei nahig. So the way you reconcile it is that in Eretz Yisrael, yes, there's going to be eye-popping paradigm shifts, but the rest of the world, everything's going to remain as it is today. Okay? But the Rebbe says, nope. And the Rebbe is going to say why, what the Radbaz tries to do by reconciling these disparate opinions by saying, well, it's okay. that you can understand them both. You can embrace them both. One is talking about Eretz Yisrael, and one is talking about the rest of the world. But the Rebbe says, "Ulam perish haradbaz l'chayra einem muvan." But it's not so understandable what the Radbaz is explaining. Ubefrat kasha lahasbir lefi zeh as das Harambam. And specifically, the Rebbe says it's very hard to superimpose the Radbaz's thesis on the Rambam. Why? Aleph. Because first of all, mistimas divrei harambam shabi ma'isa Mashiach lo yivatel davar min minhagei shel olam muvan shegam Eretz Yisrael bichlal zeh. From the way in which the Rambam writes, where he doesn't qualify, it seems that he is saying that the world will continue the way it is, inclusive of Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't say everything but Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't say Chutz La'aretz. Shechein im be'Eretz Yisrael yu nisim elu b'gashmias, harei gam zeh bitul minhagei shel olam. The Rambam says emphatically there'll be no changes to the nature of the world. Olam kiminhagei nohig. So the Rebbe says, if there will be changes in Eretz Yisrael, then that's a repudiation of what the Rambam is saying, because the Rambam says it in global fashion. That's one problem. Beis, the Rebbe says, B'mei ben Koziba, in the time of Bar Kochva, Shadimahu Rabbi Akiva v'chol chachmei derish hu hamelech HaMashiach, that Rabbi Akiva and all the other great chachamim of that time, they understood that he was Melech HaMashiach. Dima ad kedei kach, and when we say that they understood, that they conceived this, that they intellectually embraced this, let's understand what this means. This wasn't theoretic. They so much understood this to be the fact, sheyatzu lemilchama pikuach nefesh al pi tzivoyav, that they actually went to war. They put their lives on the line based on his command, based on Bar Kochva's command that they should go to war. Umizeh machiach harambam, and from this the Rambam proves shamelech HaMashiach ein tzarich la'asos oisos u'mosim v'shagam biyamav yeh olam kiminhagei noyeg. And the Rambam cites this in Hilchas Malachim. So from this, he's proving that the Melech Mashiach doesn't have to do wonders and miracles, that even when Mashiach comes, the world will continue the way it is today. Lo iru hanisim gam be'eretz Yisrael. Even in Eretz Yisrael, nisim won't happen. And therefore, it's logical to say, Shaladas Harambam Olam Kiminhagei Noyeg La'asid Lave Gam Be'eretz Yisrael. That when the Rambam says Olam Kiminhagei Noyeg, that the world will continue in its present form, the way it always acted, as it were, that also includes Eretz Yisrael. So what has the Rebbe done? He has brought down one possible way of reconciling the Rambam with other teachings based on the Radbaz, and then he has said, no, that's problematic. That can't be the answer. Okay. Now in Sehif Hey, the Rebbe is going to bring down another possible way of reconciling the Rambam's vociferous opinion that nothing is going to change with other famous teachings that we have. The Sefer Avodas HaKodesh Kosov. So the Avodas HaKodesh writes, Levar she'olam kiminhagei noheg. He wants to explain what does the Rambam mean when he says that the world will continue to act the way it always does. Perushai, the explanation is as follows. Shakadosh Baruch Hu lo yichadesh dvarim chutz min hateva. That true, Eibush is not going to create novel things that are outside of the network of the natural. Kol hinyanim shebabriya yu al tivam v'shorsham k'moi shahayu betchilas haviyasam ubriyasam. Everything is going to remain in their nature and in their source, just like it was when they were first created. What does that mean? And therefore, once you understand that, there's no stira between the Rambam and what the Medrash brings down. That the tree will be planted and will and will bear fruit, will produce fruit on the same day. And from so many other teachings of the Chachamim of this genre. Because all of these things are not novelties that are not within nature. Why? Because at the beginning of time, when Hashem created the world, that's how it was. That fruit trees gave forth their fruit in the same day. So now we could take this idea that the Avodas HaKodesh writes that things will revert back to the way they were at the very beginning of creation, before Chet Eitz Hadas, and we could understand the two psukim in Bechukosai using the same lens. Vishbati chaya mina aretz, and vilonis rak yasu peres. How do we understand that wild animals will be banished from the earth and that barren trees will give forth fruit? Sheladas harambam einheim nichshavim bitul davar miminhaga shel olam. That maybe you could take the way that Avodas HaKodesh understands it and say, what the Rambam is saying is that these differences, that wild animals will be banished, that barren trees will give forth fruit, this is not a bitul davar min haga shel olam. This is not obviating how the world normally works. Because that's exactly how the world worked before Chet Eitz Hadas. Kol ha'ilanos nasu peres, va'af achas me'achayis lo yizika. In the time before Chet Eitz Hadas, all the trees gave forth fruit, and none of the animals were harmful. Ela shalidei Chet Eitz Hadas. But what happened? Through the agency of Chet Eitz Hadas, K'she'amar Kadosh Baruch Hu v'koitz v'dardat hatzmiach, the Eibishter decreed on the earth that thorns and thistles will grow. Nasu chelek mehi ilanis rak. So a certain amount of the trees became barren. Ubechelek me'achayas nichnesa netia tivis lahazik. And a number of animals absorbed the nature of being harmful, of being predators. And because when Mashiach comes, the world is going to evolve, the world is going to be elevated, and it's going to return to its pre-Chet Eitz Hadas stature. So that's going to be the nature of the world. But it's not a novel thing, because that's the way the world was created to begin with. Now, before the Rebbe is going to obviate this way of understanding it, he's first going to connect this with something else. Seif Vav. V'yesh l'kasha zeh im shinoi ikri noisav ben loshen hataris kahanim loshen ha-gemara b'negei lilanes rak. And we might connect this with another difference. And the Rebbe says shinoi ikri, a substantial difference between what it says in the Medrash and what it says in the Gemara regarding barren trees. B'teiros kaihanim haloshin hi ilones rak asidim lios oisim peres. In the Medrash, it says that barren trees will produce fruit. Ve'ilu b'Gemara haloshin hi sheyit anu peres. But in the Gemara, the terminology is that they will carry fruit on their branches. Okay, the Medrash says they will produce fruit. The Gemara says they will carry fruit on their branches. Oisim peres kibetaris kaihanim mashma'ai. So when the Medrash says oisim peres, what does this mean? She'ilane hasrak yoitziu peres ba'isa oifen sheboi kol ilane hamaychel oisim peres. It means that barren trees will produce fruit like fruit-bearing trees in the natural way. Masha Enkin, a contradistinction, Lufia Gemara, the way the Gemara says it, Yeze ba'ifin shel yit anu. the Gemara uses the term, they will carry these fruit on their branches, shemashma'i, which means einoi gidul rogil shel ilan, that this is not the normal way in which trees grow, ela sheyitanu davar shebe'etzem eina shayach alehim, but rather that the branches will carry fruit upon them that essentially does not belong to them. Behevdel zeh, and this difference, hu behetem lechiluk ben apsukim shemehem hadavar nilmad, actually conforms to the difference in the psukim from which these teachings are derived. So the Medrash derives its teaching from one place, and the Gemara derives its teaching from a different place. B'teres kahanim halimudhu min apasuk shebeparshasenu ve'etz hasada yitain piryei. The Medrash is learning its understanding of what will happen to barren trees in the times of Mashiach from the pasuk in Bechukosai, which says, "And the tree of the field will give fruit." Hamoira, and this teaches al nesina regila shel atze hasada. This refers to the normal way in which trees of the field give forth fruit. Aval b'Gemara, but in the Gemara halimutu mikefel v'shinui lashon apasuk, but the Gemara is learning its understanding from an alliteration, from a redundancy, seeming redundancy in a verse. Ki eitz nasa piryoi te'ena v'gefen nasnu chelam. That the tree will bear, literally will hold fruit, and that the fig and the vine will give forth its strength. And Rashi on that pasuk says, "B'dichsiv te'ena v'gefen nasnu chelam hare eitz priamor." From the fact that the pasuk cites, and the fig and the vine will give forth its strength, so it's clear that this is a fruit-bearing tree. So what does the pasuk teach by saying, "And the tree will bear or hold its fruits"? So af ilane srak yiso pri. Rashi says that second clause in the pasuk comes to teach that even barren trees will hold fruit. Hainu. Shah-pasuk madgish. This means that the pasuk itself underscores Aleph as achiluk shebein eitz ilane srak ubein te'ena v'gefen eitz pri. The pasuk itself underscores that there's two categories of trees. One is fruit-bearing and one is barren. Also, beis shebe'etz pri hadavar hu ba'ofen shel nasnu chelam nesina. That when it comes to the fruit trees, the pasuk uses the word, they will give their strength, meaning a natural way in which a tree gives forth fruit. And the third thing, v'hanesina hilafi koicham utchunasam nasnu chelam. And the fact that the pasuk uses the word chelam, their strength, means that it will be in conformity with their strength and with their natural inherent composition. And the fourth thing that we learn from that pasuk is Masha Enkain, in contradistinction, Bilane Srak, when you're talking about the barren trees, the shade trees, Hadavar hu ba'ofen shel nasa. It's the pasuk uses the word they will hold, they will bear, kilu neise hu davar acher, like a person, let's say, or something that's holding something that's not inherent or endemic to itself. Loy al yedei gidul ragil. It's not something that grows naturally. Al pianal yesh leimar. So based on the above, we might say sha'achiluk bein hataris kahanim bein haGemara, that the difference between the Medrash and the Gemara in how they describe what will happen in the future to barren trees, taloi b'machleikes shematinu b'veishis rabbah. This depends on a machlekes, a difference of opinion that is found in the Medrash on Bereshis. Im betchilas habriya haitziu ilanes rak, peres im lav. If the present barren trees did at the beginning of creation give forth fruit, or they were created barren. Hatoiras Kohanim, the Medrash that we're dealing with, Koi Beshitas Rav Pinchas, embraces or points to the opinion of Rav Pinchas in the Medrash Rabbah. Shalamad mehapasuk eitz eisapri. He learns from the words in the pasuk, a tree that makes fruit. Shafilu ilanes rak asu peres. That at the beginning, even trees that are barren now were fruit bearing. Olafiza. So if you understand that at the very beginning, trees that are currently barren gave forth fruit, then what will happen when Mashiach comes is not a novelty on Ma'aseh Bereishis. It's rather a return, and it arouses the original nature of this tree, which was a fruit-bearing tree at the very beginning. And now, in the parentheses, the Rebbe brings a sidebar. And this comes as a continuation to teachings that preceded in the Medrash in Vayikra on the pasuk ve'etz hasadeh yitim period, and the tree of the field will give its fruits. That it says there, like kederach shehi oisa achshav, not like what the tree does now, that it's barren, ela kederach she'asasa b'mei Adam Harishon, but rather what the tree did in the times of Adam Harishon before the Chet, eitz pri oisa pri laminoi, a fruit tree that gives forth fruit to its kind, melamed, boy bayom shehu natua, boy bayom oisa peras. This teaches, eitz pri oisa pri laminoi teaches that we didn't have to wait for years for the fruit to grow. It grew in the same day. And similarly, it says that in the future, the tree will be edible. That it will be like it was in the times of Adam Harishon, like it is taught on the pasuk Eitz Pri. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, so look in footnote 47, where the Rebbe acknowledges what you're thinking. Look down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines from the top of Ara 47, Avol Ra'ei, Ramban, Bereshis Aleph, Chavtes, B'Seifei, Deloy Haya Kain Sha'etz Necha Lefni Ha'etz. The Ramban brings down that it was not so. The tree, the bark, the twigs, the branches were not edible. The Kehei Gavna the Perish Rashi Bereshis, Shebazeh Kilkala Loy Eitz Pri. And Rashi brings down the same opinion, that the earth was, because the earth went against Hashem's command. Hashem's original command was that all of the tree should taste like the fruit, but the tree rebelled against that and gave forth only fruit, but not a tree that tastes like the fruit, and therefore it was cursed. Okay. Now, after the parentheses, Masha Enkein, so that's all the Medrash, the Tois Kahanim. Masha Enkein das Gemara, he commanded Amar, but the Gemara is going along with the opinion Shebetchila Sabriya Loi Nasu Ilanis Rak Peres, that at the beginning of creation there were barren trees. V'nimtza shemasha yisu peres la'asid hu shinoi shel chidush. So the fact that barren trees will give forth fruit in the future, this is a novelty. It's not reverting back to its original nature before the sin. No, it's a novelty. V'lachein yezeh ba'ofen shel yit'anu nasa piryei v'lei ba'ofen rogel v'tivi, and that's why it will be in a way that is not natural. Remember that word yit'anu. The branches will carry fruit, but it won't be like fruit trees that naturally give forth fruit. Zayin. Avolkad daikes shapir, but after careful analysis, or literally if you want to be more specific, you cannot embrace this thesis, this way of reconciling the Rambam and other opinions, that it's a reverting back to the original nature of the world before the Chet. Rebbe says, no, mikama panim. And you can't do this from a number of angles. Aleph, haperish hanal b'toyes kahanim shebilonis rak yochel liyos v'achin yiyah shinui zel asid mishum shachein haya b'tchilas habriya. To explain the medrash in this way, that barren trees will become fruit bearing like they were at the beginning of creation, eina mechaver. It doesn't compute. Legabe hinyanim hakoidmim shebapasuk nemar b'toyes kahanim b'perish yukiderach she'asasa b'mei adam arishon. Concerning other things that are in the verse, the Medrash says very clearly that it will be like in the times of Adam Arishon. V'hadavar nilmad milshenes hapsukim b'mei Adam Arishon b'ma'aseh bereshis. And the Medrash learns this from actual words and teachings in the psukim about creation. Masha enkein legabe elonis rak. But this teaching about barren trees giving forth fruit, there the Medrash does not say that it will revert back to the way it was in the times of Adam Arishon. And this whole idea that barren trees will give forth fruit is not based on any pasuk in Bereshis. It's based on a pasuk in Bechukosai, the Eitza Sadayitim period. Hamidubar b'dul asid lovei, that is talking about the future. So that's number one. The Rebbe says this is not going to help us to reconcile the Rambam's opinion and the other teachings that say the world is going to change radically. Nope, this is not working. Bays, and from another angle. Let's say you're going to find a way to say that what the Medrash says, that it's going to revert to the way it was in the times of Adam Rishon, also applies to barren trees. And that the Medrash is embracing the opinion of Rav Pinchas that this is how it was at the beginning of creation. Adayan ein hadavar misyashiv kol tzarchai. It's still not enough. Why? Because the Rebbe says, Das Rav Pinchasi shemitzad abriya atzma mitzad tzivay kadosh baruch hu hayu tzrichim liyos ilanes rak. Rav Pinchas's opinion is that at the very beginning, Hashem commanded that there should be barren trees. Elisha aretz shinta mehatzivoy vilane hasrak nosnu peres. But the earth itself rebelled against or changed Hashem's command and gave forth fruit-bearing trees. But after the sin, those trees that were supposed to be barren reverted to being barren. V'nimtza sheminhagei shel olam mitzad atzmai hu lehefach sheyiyu ilanes rak. That means that when the Rambam says olam kiminhagei noihe, that the world will continue to go along in the way that is natural, it means that it's natural for there to be certain trees that are barren. So again, this is not reconciling what the Rambam is saying with what the Medrash says. Gimel, and thirdly, and in any event, bichlal kasha lefarish kein das harambam. It is very hard to superimpose this explanation that the Rebbe brought down from the Sefer Avodas HaKodesh on what the Rambam is teaching. Ki mitaychen vehemshach dvarav muchach sheshola loy rak chidush b'masa bereshis. V'haynu davar shaloi hayim ha'olam b'masa bereshis. Ella gam bitul davar miminhagay shel olam ki im olam ki minhagay noihe. The Rebbe says, most importantly, it's really hard to conceive from the context of what the Rambam says. When you continue to learn what the Rambam says, it's very hard to embrace this idea that he means that things are going to revert to the way they were in the beginning. Because it's clear that not only does he obviate that there will be any changes to Maaseh Bereshis, that means that there will be things that never existed when the world was created, but he also obviates anything that's not the way the world is now. Upshite, and it's very clear, shenyanim hashinuyim, that these things, that there will be no predators among animals, that there'll be no more barren trees, eina minhagay shalaylam. That's not the way the world comports itself today. Perush. And the Rebbe explains this. Minhagay shel olam hu oifen hanhagas ha'olam bepoil bekfios. When the Rambam says minhagay shel olam, the way the world acts, he means the way the world acts on an ongoing basis. Ve'ein kol nafkamina masa yitchila hanhaga kfozu. And to the Rambam, there's no difference. He's not concerned with when did the world begin to act this way. In betchilas habriya mamash or yacharkach, if it was actually at the creation of the world, or it happened after the sin. La'achar shenikva betivam shalilanes rak shelo peras or betivam shel chayis roy sheyaziku. But once this became the norm, that there are barren trees that don't give forth fruit, and there are animals that are predators and are harmful, and so this is the way these trees have acted, this is the way these animals have acted for thousands of years. This is considered minhagay shalaylam, the way the world turns. And if some change is going to happen, and that change means that the trees act differently, the animals act opposite of their normal nature, this is obviating the minhagay shel olam, and therefore this idea that it's a reversion back to the way it was at Maaseh Bereshis, no, this does not really jive with what the Rambam is saying. And there's for sure no way to say that the nature of barren trees won't change. The Rebbe says, for sure, we have to rebut the idea that really there's no change to barren trees, because really they are trees that give forth fruit, except because of some external factor, God put a gezerah on them that they don't practically bear fruit. And the Rebbe says the same thing. You can't say that in actuality these are calm, docile animals, but because of some external factor, the Eibishter commanded that they should become predators. Ki im perish hadavarhu, but rather shalachar chet etzadas batal tiva makoidim bizman hazeh hemilon israk v'chayes toifas betiva. Rebbe says you can't say that really they're one thing, but after chet hadas, their original nature changed, and so now they are barren trees. Now they are predators. So basically, the Rebbe says this won't work. And so in Ches, the Rebbe begins to roll out his reconciliation, his understanding of the Rambam opining vociferously that nothing will change, and the many teachings that talk about things that will change. But the Rebbe says, before we do that, we have to look in the Rambam himself, where there seems to be a contradiction in his own teachings. The Yuvan, I will understand it, the Hektim Tosefes Bir Bedas HaRambam, by first prefacing with greater understanding in the Rambam himself. Mashanakat HaRambam, Shabi Mois HaMashiach Olam Kiminhoigin Noheg. L'chayra hu mishum desfira le kedeya zu shehevi she'ein bein ha'olam hazeh le'moisa Mashiach ela shibud malchus bilvad, and this is Dash Shmuel B'Gemara. The thesis that the Rambam puts forth, that the world will continue to act just like it acts today in the times of Mashiach, seemingly this is because he opines like the opinion that is brought down in the Gemara of Reb Shmuel, that there is no difference between the world now and the times of Mashiach, except that we will be freed of the subjugation of other nations upon us. Okay? The Rebbe says, "V'yiduos kushyeis halechem Mishnah," but it's well known that the Lechem Mishnah, the Mefarish on, or a Mefarish, a very well-known Mefarish on the Rambam, questions on this. Shematzinu shepsaka Rambam lalacha b'stir lezeh, that the Rambam himself paskins differently, antithetically to this. Aleph, the Gemara Isa, and it seems to be based on what it says in the Gemara. V'amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Reb Yechanan, Kol hanavim kulan loy nisnabu ela le'moisa Mashiach. All the prophecies of all the prophets, that was all relating to the days of Mashiach. Avala elam haba, but when it comes to elam haba, ayin le'rasa elikim zulasecha. This only Hashem knows. This only Hashem sees. Ufliga de Shmuel. And this is a conflict. This is a contradiction with the opinion of Shmuel. De Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel taught, Ein bein ha'olam hazeh le'moisa Mashiach, there's no difference between now and when Mashiach comes, Elo shibud malchus bavad. Okay. Upasuk harambam, ki Reb Chia bar Abba, de polag Shmuel. But the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, so there's a conflict in the Rambam's writing himself between Hilchos Malachim and Hilchos Tshuva. Because in Hilchos Malachim, he's embracing the opinion that everything is going to be just like it is today. And he's embracing Shmuel's opinion. But in Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam is paskening Reb Chia bar Abba, who differs with Shmuel. Amru Chachamim, Kol Hanavim Kulam Loy Nibu Ela L'Moisa Mashiach, Aval Ha'elam Haba Ayin Le'Rasa Elokim Zulasecha. So it seems the Rambam is saying that there are going to be differences, and only Hashem knows what those differences are. Also, the Mishnah Nemar, there's a Mishnah that says, Lo Yetze Ish, that a man is not allowed to leave his home on Shabbos, Loi b'sayif, v'loi b'keshes, not with a sword or I am forgetting the word for that kind, a saber, not with a saber, and not with a bow, etc. V'im yatza, and if he did go out on Shabbos with these things, chayav chatas, he has to bring a korban chatas. Rabbi Eliezer in the Gemara says, tachshitin hein. It's not a sin, because these are considered accessories or ornaments for a man. So he's allowed to go out on Shabbos with them. The Chachamim, but the Chachamim opined, Einon ela l'gnai. These are not accessories, these are not ornaments, they're actually shameful. They're actually a negative thing. It's a negative statement of reality. Shenemar, like it says in Yeshayahu, V'chitetu charvoisam le'itim, that they will beat their swords into plowshares. V'chani noisehem lemazmeres, and they will beat their spears into pruning shears. La'yisa goyel goy milchama, la'yisa goyel goy cherev v'layumdu eid milchama. There'll be no more war. And Rashi says, V'itach shitin ninhu, and if implements of war would be considered accessories, if they would be considered ornaments, lo yubatelan lasid, then they wouldn't be something that won't happen in the future. In other words, Yeshayahu is saying all these things are going to go bye-bye. They're implements of war, but they're going to be turned into implements with which you grow produce, peaceful things. So this means that this is never actually an ornament. It's never something that accessorizes a person. It's never something positive. It's a necessary evil, but it's a gnai. So this means that the world is going to change. And there's two opinions in the Gemara about this Mishnah. According to one opinion, even Rabbi Eliezer acknowledges that implements of war are going to be completely obsolete when the Mashiach comes. Upligei de Shmuel. So this differs with Reb Shmuel, and it supports Reb Chia. Reb Shmuel says the world's going to remain the same. Reb Chia says no, there's going to be big differences. So pligei de Shmuel misayel Reb Chia baraba. That's one opinion. Uladeya acheres, but another opinion, the Gemara there, svira le Reb Eliezer, opines with Rabbi Eliezer that you can walk out on Shabbos with these things, that it's not a sin, that you don't have to bring a karban chatas if a man walks out with his saber or with his bow and arrow. Because Rabbi Eliezer opines she'ena b'telin l'meitza Mashiach, hainu d'Shmuel u'pligei de Reb Chia baraba. That means that he supports Shmuel, who opines in the Gemara that there's not going to be any difference between now and Yemaisa Mashiach except subjugation to other nations. Alma, but according to all opinions, das chachamim hi shekli zayim b'telin l'meisa Mashiach. But the Gemara concludes that according to all opinions, there will be no implements of war in the times of Mashiach. Ulefichach, and therefore, im yatsa b'sayif, if a man went out with his saber on Shabbos, chayev chatas, it's a sin, and he has to bring a karban chatas. Upasa karambam gechachamim, and the Rambam in his own writings paskins according to the Chachamim. Which means he doesn't accept the opinion of Reb Shmuel. And what was the opinion of Reb Shmuel? That there'll be no difference between now and the times of Mashiach, except that in the times of Mashiach, we will not be subjugated to other nations. This was all the Rebbe wants to explain to us that before we seek to reconcile the Rambam with other teachings, first we have to reconcile the Rambam with the Rambam himself. Because in one place, he says there's not going to be any difference. And in another place, he paskins like the Chachamim, that the world is going to change. That, for instance, there will be no implements of war. And that's why even now it can never be seen as an accessory or an ornament for a man, because it's just a necessary evil. It's not anything that really beautifies the person who wears these things. Tess. The explanation is as follows. L'ch'oira, seemingly, kasav harambam shleimas hamashiach lo yivatel davar miminhagah shel olam v'lo yeh kol chidush b'maaseh bereshis. It's how is it possible to understand that the Rambam wrote that there's not going to be any differences between now and the days of Mashiach? How can you understand this? Wasn't the Rambam the same person who penned the 13 principles of faith? And isn't one of those that is going to be the resurrection of the dead? And isn't that bitul minhagah shel olam v'chidush b'maaseh bereshis? Come now. Can you actually say with a straight face that the resurrection of the dead is not a difference? That this is the way the world always acted? Now the Rebbe says, and it would be one thing to try to reconcile this with the opinions that Tchias HaMesim is different from Olam Haba. V'tach l'shleimus haschar hi l'nshamas begufim. Harei Tchias HaMesim hi inyan b'fnei atzmai v'loi chelek mimais HaMashiach. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. It's one thing to reconcile this according to the Shita of the Ramban, who says that Olam HaTchiyah, that Tchias HaMesim, is the same thing as Olam Haba, and that is the ultimate schar, neshamais in gufim, which means that Tchias HaMesim is a different era and a different thing, and it's not part of Yemais HaMashiach. So if the Rambam would agree with the Ramban, we could still understand how to reconcile it. We could say that the Rambam is saying that when Mashiach comes, the world's going to remain the way it is now. In a future era, there's going to be Tchias HaMesim. Avaloshitas HaRambam, but this is one of the famous places where the Rambam and the Ramban diverge. The Rambam opines she'olam haba hu olam hanashamas belikufim, ve'olam hatchia einay tach l'shleimas haschar. The Rambam opines that olam haba is not a place where there's neshamas bikufim. It's only neshamas without kufim, and tchias hamesim ve'olam hatchia is not the ultimate shleimas of the schar. Ela shetchias hamesim tia bizman ubetkufa shel yimais hamashiach. The Rambam opines that Tchias HaMesim is going to happen during the time of Mashiach. Lifnei boy haneshama la'olam haba. Before the neshama comes to olam haba. Harei nimtza l'shita zu. So once you understand the Rambam shita, that Tchias HaMesim is going to happen as part of Mashiach's coming, it comes out Shiach Chidush b'Ma'aseh Bereshis, Tchias HaMesim, Ma'aseh Mashiach. It's very hard to argue that there's not going to be any differences. How is it possible to argue that nothing will change from the way the world works? I mean, what could be a bigger change in Tchias HaMesim? And so we have to say, and this is the Rebbe's way of explaining this. Shaladas Harambam Elohim Shnei Inyanim Shainim B'Shnei Zmanim Shainim. That what the Rambam is teaching us is that there are two different paradigms that will take place in two different times. Yesh Inyan Uzman B'Mais HaMashiach HaKashor Levias HaMashiach. There is an era that is connected to the coming of Mashiach. And then there is a second era that will be added after the beginning era, which is about the time that Mashiach comes. And in that second era, there will be other things, different things that will continue, that will come to the fore. Things that Hashem will do in that time, and that will include very big differences from the way the world is now. Okay, so again, just to recap this, the Rebbe says the way to understand that the Rambam says that there's not going to be any shinui, there's not going to be any difference. That the world is going to continue just the way it is now. And at the same time, the Rambam himself says it's going to be differences. The Rebbe brought a few examples, including the fact that the Rambam clearly believes that implements of war are going to become obsolete. That's a big change from the way the world is now. So the Rebbe says it's because the Rambam is teaching that there are two eras. There's the era of Bias Mashiach, when Mashiach comes, and then there's going to be an additional era after that. And in that additional era, there are going to be rolled out all kinds of shinuyim, all kinds of changes. And this will be at a later time, Yemais HaMashiach Gufa. Within Yemais HaMashiach, this will be in a later era. Yud. Valpizem muvan hatam shebereish perak yud beis loy hevi harambam kol raya v'hichacha ledvarav al yala al alev shebimais HaMashiach yivatel davar miminhagei shel olam. Now the Rebbe says, now we can understand the difference between what the Rambam does in Perek Yud Beis and in Perek Yud Aleph. In Perek Yud Beis, the Rambam does not bring any supporting proof texts to his assertion that you shouldn't even think that in Yemais HaMashiach there's going to be any difference from what there is today. And this is different from what he did earlier, Kederach Shehevi Beperek Shalafanav, from what he did in Perek Yud Aleph, Al Zeh Shemashiach Ein Tzarech Laharis Oisim Meifes. So this is in contradistinction to what the Rambam taught in Perek Yud Aleph, where he said that Mashiach is not going to have to show or prove his credentials by doing miracles. V'zel l'shaynai. And this is what the Rambam wrote in Perek Yud Aleph to prove his assertion that Mashiach will not have to do miracles. V'al yala al daitcha she'hamelech haMashiach tzarech la'asos oisos u'movsim u'mchadish dvarim ba'olam u'mechayamesim u'chayotze b'dvarim elu. You shouldn't think that Melech Mashiach will have to do wonders and miracles and will have to do novel things in the world, like resurrect the dead, etc. Eina davar kach. The Rambam says it's not like that. Shari Rabbi Akiva chacham gadol mechachmei haMishnah haya, v'hu haya nois kelev shel ben Kuzbi, shel ben Kuziba hamelech, v'hu haya omer alav shu hamelech haMashiach. And the Rambam brings proof from Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the greatest of all Chachamim of the Mishnah, that he was an arms bearer for Ben Kuziba, for Bar Kokhba. He believed him to be the king. He said about him he was the king Mashiach. V'dimahu v'chol chachmei darish hu hamelech haMashiach. And they all embraced, they all asserted, they all understood, they all conceived of him as Melech HaMashiach. Until Ad Shenerag Ba'avonos, until he was killed because of his sins. Kevan Shenerag. Once he died, they knew that he wasn't Mashiach. But it wasn't because he couldn't do miracles that they threw him to disrepute. It was because he did sins and he died from his own sins. Even though seemingly the Rambam is talking about two different things in these two prakim. In Perek Yud Aleph, he's talking about the persona, Melech HaMashiach, Pulasai v'Ofen Biasai, what he will accomplish, how he will come. And in Perek Yud Beis, he's speaking about the overall situation of the world, the universal reality. Mikol Makom, still in all, Gam bePerek Yud Beis hanidon hu matzav ha'olam bekesher levias Mashiach. What the Rebbe is saying here is that in Perek Yud Beis, it's still actually talking about that era of vias Mashiach, of the coming of Mashiach. And therefore, Harayish bePerek Yud Aleph legabe Melech Mashiach koicha yafa gam legabe inyanim hamidbarim bePerek Yud Beis. And therefore, the proof texts from Rabbi Akiva and how he related to Bar Kokhba still hold strong and true for Perek Yud Beis as well. Matzav ha'olam b'meisa Mashiach b'masha kashu levi asay u'mehem she'olam kiminagei nayek. So Perek Yud Beis, when it talks in universal manner about what the world will be like, is still talking about that first era, vias Mashiach. Shekain. Ilu hayagedei Maisa Mashiach bitul minhagei shel olam v'chidush b'maisa bereishis, azay hayanimtza shezehu inyanei shel Mashiach. If the description or the category of Maisa Mashiach would mean the complete obviating of how the world comports itself now, how the world acts now, and it would be a complete novelty of Maisa Bereishis, then that would mean that is the inyan of Mashiach, that is kind of what Mashiach's job is. B'yaseh shel Mashiach mevia ima es bitul min hagay shel olam v'chidush Maisa Bereishis. It would mean that the coming of Mashiach brings with it a radical paradigm shift. Everything changes. The way the world is now, the way it was created, all changes. V'imkein, hayat tzarich leima shemashiach tzarich la'asos osos u'movsim u'mechadesh dvarim ba'olam. And if that is what the Rambam understood about the coming of Mashiach, about Bias Mashiach, then he would have had to say very different from what he says. He would have had to paskin the opposite, that Melech HaMashiach has to do miracles. He has to create novelties. Umemela, zui gam habchina v'habedika alimitasai. That would be the way to substantiate if it's a true Mashiach or not. Imhu Mashiach, Kevan Shezet Teichen Chidushay. That would be his calling card. That would be the way to substantiate that this is actually Mashiach. But the Rambam determined the opposite. The Kevon Shechriach Rambam Miyachas Rabbi Akiva v'chol Chachmei Dor Leven Kuziba Shemashiach Einay Tzarech Lasas on my face. But because the Rambam determines from the way that Rabbi Akiva related and all the great Chachamim of that generation related to Bar Kokhba, he concludes he concludes that Mashiach does wonders and miracles. Move on, umuchach mizeh. So it's understood and it's proven from this. Shabias HaMashiach eina mevia ima as bitul min shel olam. It means that the coming of Mashiach does not bring with it a complete repudiation of how the world runs now. Yud Aleph. Val pizeh move on, and through this it's understood. That when the Rambam explains what the world is going to be like when Mashiach comes in quite elongated fashion, all of this is regarding that first era when Mashiach first bursts on the scene, when Mashiach first makes an appearance. Kalaimar, this is to say, Tchila, the Perek Yud Aleph Mevara Rambam. First, in Perek Yud Aleph, the Rambam explains, Mahu Idyani Shel Mashiach, Shel Melech HaMashiach. He explains, what is the essence of Melech HaMashiach? HaMelech HaMashiach asid la'amoid u'la'chazir malchus David liyeshna. Lememshala harishayna. That Melech HaMashiach is going to return the Malchus Beis David to its original glory and its original splendor and sovereignty. Ubayna HaMikdash, and will build the Beis HaMikdash. Umekabes Nitchei Yisrael, and will gather the banished of Yisrael from all four corners of the world. The Chayizrin Kol HaMishpatim, and will return all of the laws and all of the statutes like they were. Hainu. From this description, what is Mashiach going to do? He is going to bring completion and fruition to Torah, to halacha, to mitzvahs. And then the Rambam continues in the next parak. In the next parak, the Rambam describes the situation of the world that will be in conformity with Torah and mitzvahs returning to its completion. Ukesiyum devarav, and at the very end, he says, "Sheyisrael yiyu pnuyim b'Torah v'chachmasa," that Bnei Yisrael will be free just to study Torah. That's all we will do. Uba'ese hazman, and at that time, lo yesham, lo ra'av, lo milchama chulei. There'll be no famine, there'll be no war. V'lo yeh kol ha'olam, ela l'das Hashem bilvad. And the only vocation and avocation of the entire world will be to know Hashem. Ulefichach yu Yisrael chachamim gedolim, and therefore Bnei Yisrael will be great scholars. V'ikar kiyum hamitzvos v'hilchos haTorah hu ba'olam asher kiminhag noig. And the Rebbe says it has to be an olam kiminhag noig. It has to be in a natural world, because ikar mitzvos and halachos pertain to a natural world, not to a transcendent plane, to some kind of a spiritual plane. It seems the Rambam is teaching that the main thing of Mashiach is to return all of Torah and mitzvahs to its completion. All of this takes place within a Gashmistic world. Yud Beis. Al Pikol Hanal. You see, we're already tasting Mashiach. Women are learning Torah because there's nothing else to do. There's no potatoes to peel and there's no oranges to squeeze and no lemons. Nothing else to do. Baruch Hashem. Al pikol anal tuvan gam shitas harambam bekesher lepsuke haTorah umamari chazal hashonim oidas hayudim v'chulei del asid. And now the Rebbe says we're in a position to circle back and to reconcile what the Rambam is saying, juxtaposed against the psukim of the Torah and the Mamari Chazal that describe and give us the promises regarding Asid Lavai. And the Rebbe says like this: Hayudim v'hanivois ha'eskim b'mashiach gufa b'ma'asav u'b'mashiach ba'olam k'teitza miviyasai mifarish harambam she'ena bittul min hagay shalaylam. All the promises and all the prophecies that deal with Mashiach himself, with what he's going to do, and what the world is going to look like as a result of what he's going to do, the Rambam explains this as being a natural world. The world is not going to veer from its natural state. V'lachein pirish as a pasuk gerz evim keves, and that's why the Rambam says about the iconic verse, and the wolf will lie down with the lamb. Ha'amor behemshach levayetze v'yatsa, sorry, chayter migezer yishai. I could feel more Naiman correcting me. A shoot will emerge from the stem of Yishai. I'll be curious if people could put in the chat if they learned these psukim with Amor Naiman, who also, by the way, made us memorize all of this. So the Rambam says, Hu mashal v'chida. So in conformity with how the Rambam sees this happening, he says that that is an allegory. That it's not going to actually be that the wolf will lie down with a lamb, but rather that Bnei Yisrael will be able to live with our enemies. Ubir beperish mahu hamashal v'achidush pasuk zeh, and he explains in his parish how to unpack this allegory. Sheyu Yisrael yoshvin levetach im rishoi akum, that Bnei Yisrael will be able to live in peace with the vile and evil worshippers of idols or stars. And this is even though he continues to maintain that it's all allegory. And with the other allegories, he doesn't unpack them. Ella Adrab, on the contrary, Chasam is Devarav. How does he finish his words? He says, that only in the times of Mashiach will it be ascertained for all what exactly this means. Ki iker kavanasai lohidia shebepasuk zeh haba behemshach levayetze v'yatza chayter gomer mivur inyane shel Mashiach. Because the main thing that he intends to do is to tell us that in this continuation of this pasuk, which says that a shoot will emerge from the stem of Yishai, is explaining the inyan of Mashiach, which is Shelo Yiu LiYisrael Kol Bilbulim Ne'umas Ha'elam. That Bnei Yisrael will not be disturbed and will not be perturbed by the other nations, or memela, and therefore yupnuyim b'Torah or b'chachmasa, and therefore will be free to learn Torah and to learn its wisdom. Masha enkein hapsukim amaresal she'ena midabrim behemshech l'mashiach uv'yasai. But in contradistinction, all the other verses and all the other teachings in the Gemara that are not talking about Mashiach's coming, but rather they deal with prophecies and promises about the time to come, inclusive of the ones we spoke about earlier from this Parsha Bechukosai, Vishbati Chayira min Aretz, I will banish wild animals from the land, O Maimer Zal Hanal, and the aforementioned teaching of the Gemara that Ilane Srak Asidim Lios Oisim Peres, that the barren trees will give forth fruit. Harambam Achein Yifarsham She'ena Mashal Ela Kipshutam. V'zeyiyah bitkufa mu'cheres yoser b'maisa Mashiach kufa. So the Rambam says, yes, that is pshat, but only in a later era. That Yemais HaMashiach is comprised of two eras, and that will only be in a later era. Yud Gimel. Al pi hanal yuvan. And so now, based on what the Rabbis explained about the two eras, now we'll understand better hachiluk bein hamaymer b'toris kahanim and bein hamimmer b'ksuvos. Now we're going to be able to understand the difference between what is said about the barren trees in the Medrash and what is said in the Gemara and Ksubas. Hamimra b'gemara b'ksuves hasidin kalilani structure be'eretz Yisrael sheyit anu peres. In the Gemara, it says that in the future, all the barren trees in Eretz Yisrael will hold on their branches fruit. Hamayr shadavar ena inyan tivi. This points to the fact that this is not a natural thing, as the Rebbe explained earlier, that Rashi brings down, that the word yit anu means that these fruit are not inherent to the tree. Ela ini miyucha ube'eretz Yisrael dafka. But this is like a special thing, and specifically only in Eretz Yisrael. This midaberes b'tkufa rishona. This is referring to the first era. Sheba yiyah l'das man da'amar ze b'ksuves chidush neis be'eretz Yisrael. So this conforms to the first era that the Rambam is delineating, where there will be very circumscribed, limited nisim in Eretz Yisrael. Umashakasu b'teres kahanim bistam. But regarding what it says in the Medrash, where it's unqualified, it doesn't say it will only happen in Eretz Yisrael. Afi lanes rak asidim lios eisim peres shekain yiyah teva hilanos. So from the Medrash comes out that the nature of barren trees will change, and it will happen b'chol ha'olam, all over the world. This koi b'tkufa hashniya b'mayis Mashiach. This refers to the second era. Sheba yachul shinoi v'chidush b'mayis bereshis. Then will begin a complete novel paradigm shift in the creation of the universe. And then even barren trees will naturally give forth fruit. Yudalit. Jane, I just opened my chat to see who else remembered Mor Nyman, and I see that you wrote a question, so let me address it now, because it seems like it was from a while ago. Other changes will be chazer will be kosher. It will itself acknowledge Hashem, behave according to divine laws, a transformation, not a banishment. And also we will follow Shaman Hillel, which will be a paradigm shift, a paradigm change. Yes, all true. Thank you. But it seems, and I don't know for certain, Jane, but it seems that maybe those changes that you're referring to will be in the second era. Bal pizeh muvan she'ein stira ben divrei harambam, ein bein ha'olam hazeh limais ha'mashiach elo shibun malchis bilbad, hamedabrim b'tkufa harishona shel limais ha'mashiach, lema shepasuk shekol hanavim kulam lo nibu elo limais ha'mashiach hulei b'tkufa ha'mucheres b'limais ha'mashiach. So Rebbe says, so now we understand that there's no stira, there's no contradiction in the writings of the Rambam himself, because where it seems to be a contradiction, it's simply that he's talking about the two different eras. And now we understand why he paskins la'alacha that if you go out with implements of war, you have to bring a chatas because you are carrying on Shabbos, because it cannot be construed as an accessory or an ornament. Ki es hapasuk v'chitetu charvoisam le'itim hamedaber b'matzav ha'olam she'eh la'asir lavoi mifarish harambam kipshutei v'loi b'derech mashal b'vat. Because the pasuk that you will beat the swords into plowshares, that talks about how the world will be in the future, the Rambam understands this to mean quite literally, not an allegory. But it will happen in the later era of Yemais HaMashiach. And because there will no longer be implements of war in that later era, this is proof that they can never be considered ornaments. So even today, if a man walks out with them on Shabbos and there's no Eruv, he is in trespass of the law of not carrying on Shabbos. And based on the above, we can now reconcile something additional. Gemara Hanal, in the above mentioned Gemara where it says Kol Hanavim Lo Nisnabu Ela L'Mais HaMashiach, that everything that the Nevi'im prophesied was about Mais HaMashiach. So there, Huva Behemshech Lazeh, in that Gemara, there's something that is brought afterwards. and that was Va'amar Reb Chia Chulei. Reb Chia said, Kol hanavim kulon loy nisnabu ella lebali teshuva. Everything that the Nevi'im prophesied was only for Bali Tshuva. Aval tzadikim gimurim, but tzadikim, complete tzadikim, ayin leiras elakim zulasecha. Nobody but Hashem knows that level. Uplikid Rabavo, and this goes against what Rabbi Avo taught. The Amar Rabbi Avo taught, Makim Shabali Tshuva Aimdim, tzadikim gimurim einan aimdim. That in the place where Bal Tshuva stand, tzadikim can never stand. So this goes against what Reb Chia says, that Balei Tshuva can get a certain level, the nevuah of the Nevi'im, but tzadikim gemurim, they're going to see what only Hashem can see. Now the Rebbe says, "V'keivan sheshtei hamimreis di Reb Chia bar Abba amar Rabbi Yochanan bo behemshech ziluzu," because both of these teachings come in one continuous place. They come, one comes after the other. Mashma shehin shaycha zulazu. It means that there's a connection. Kiloima, that means l'shitasoi shel kol hanavim kulan lo nisnabu elei moisa mashiach tzarich loimar gam shekol hanavim kulam lo nisnabu elei lebali tshuva deloi kirabavo or deloi kishmuel. So it comes out again that it seems that we have a stira, because that means that the idea that the Nevi'im all told only about Yemais HaMashiach has to conform with the teaching that everything the Nevi'im said was only to Bali Tshuva. But this would be against Rabbi Avo, and this would be against Reb Shmuel. And the Rambam seems to have embraced Reb Shmuel's opinion, which is that the only difference between now and Yemais HaMashiach will be freedom from subjugation to the other nations of the world. But the Rebbe says again, it's not a stira. Ach matzinu b'das harambam. But we find in the opinion of the Rambam, she'av al pisha kasav amru chachamim kol hanavim kulam lo yinivu ela l'mais hamashiach kinal sifches mikol makim pasuk amru chachamim makim shebali tshuva emdim ein tzadikim mor yachim la'amayit by. The Rambam embraces both. He embraces both the fact that everything that the Nevi'im spoke about was only about Yemais HaMashiach, and he also embraces that Baalei Tshuva stand in a higher place than tzaddikim. How could this be? But based on what the Rebbe explained to us, it's understood. Kima sha'al liba de Rabbi Chia bar Abba amar Rabbi Yochanan tzaddikim gdolim Baalei Tshuva. Because this, that Reb Chia bar Abba says in the name of Yochanan, that tzaddikim are greater than Baalei Tshuva. With this, he veers according to his constant thesis, which is that at the beginning of Yemais HaMashiach, there will already be an eradication of the way the world is now. This is what the Nevi'im said Nevu about. Aval l'shitas harambam shebetchilas Yemais HaMashiach olam kimenagay noheg ein ze machriach shetzadikim gedolim bali tshuva. But according to the Rambam, who says that at the beginning of the time of Mashiach, the world will be the way it is now, that doesn't force the idea that tzaddikim will be greater than bali tshuva. The opposite. Bali tshuva, like today, are greater than tzaddikim, even in that first part of Yemais HaMashiach. Tezayin. La'acharei kol hanal, after everything that has been said above, adayan ein ze muzbar, but there's still something that remains unexplained. Kevon shegeder Yemais HaMashiach haba behemshech levias HaMashiach kashur l'das HaRambam bekach she'olam kimenhagei noyeg. Once we understand how the Rambam understands the category of Yemais HaMashiach, that there's an era in Yemais HaMashiach, that is a continuation of the coming of Mashiach, which will be a time where the world will continue to act just as it is now. Madua mukhrach sheb'Yemais HaMashiach gufa tiyeh tkufa nosefes shebo yivatla minhagei shel olam. So what drives the imperative for there, in fact, to be a time where the world will be very different than it is now? The Rambam is telling us that in the first Kufa, in the first era, everything's going to be the same. Why does there have to be a time where everything's going to be different? What's the imperative for that? Va'id ve'ikar, mahi oisa siba nifla'a, shetavi v'titzor chidush niflaza. And what is going to be that catalytic event that's going to drive this tremendous paradigm shift? Hanhaga b'tkufa shniya. What's going to be the all right, what's the matter with me? Okay, I can't. Well, anyway, what's going to be that event that's going to make the entire world different? The Yuvan, I will understand this. Bahaktim divrei Rambam bigeres chias hamesim shalei. We'll understand this by first prefacing what the Rambam wrote in his famous Igeres Tchias HaMesim, in the epistle, in the letter that he sent regarding Tchias HaMesim. Shema Shapirish es hayudim de la'asid, shehi mashal v'chida, that concerning what he wrote about the promises of the future, that the wolf will lie down with the lamb, etc., that the Rambam says that they are an allegory, that they are a riddle. So in his epistle about the resurrection of the dead, the Rambam writes, Ein divareinu zeh hechlati. These words are not conclusive, cholei, shehim mashal. Ve'efsher sheyiskaimu kipshuta. It's true that I'm opining that they are a mashal, but that's not my final word. It's not conclusive. It is still possible that they should actually happen literally. Sorry, Miri, we're in the third paragraph of Seif Tezayin, on page 13 of the Sefer. Ulachayra, seemingly, Lefi hamavor le'il and Sif Yud Aleph Yud Beis Harei behechrach lefarish hayudim hamedabrim b'shaychet Mashiach uviyasei einam bitul davar min hagashal. It would seem that based on everything that we've learned above, specifically in Sif Yud Aleph and Yud Beis, it's imperative to understand these promises about Mashiach as allegory, because they're not going to upend the natural state of the world. Because we have already established that the whole point of Mashiach is to effectuate a situation of learning Torah, doing all the mitzvahs in the world as it is today. The Rebbe says we might say that the explanation is as follows. Yuduim divrei hagemara. It is well known, the words of the Gemara, legabe stiras hapsukim. There is a stira in two psukim. There's a contradiction, seeming contradiction in two psukim in the Nevi'im. In Daniel it says, va'aru, and behold, emanane shmaya kibar inesh ata. Behold, he will come on the clouds of the heaven like a man. And then in Zechariah it says, Uksiv ani v'roichiv al chamor, that he's going to be like a beggar, like a poor man coming on a donkey. So which one is it? And the Rebbe is going to say how this is reconciled. And the Rebbe says in the parentheses, and other seemingly disparate teachings are also reconciled in the same manner. And we understand and we extrapolate from this about many other things about the coming of Mashiach. She'im yu Yisrael b'matzav shel zachu, if Bnei Israel are going to be deserving, you kolin yanim ba'ifin achel lagamrei ba'ifin isi, then everything's going to happen in an otherworldly manner, in a miraculous manner. And this is also one of the ways of resolving the famous argument about how the Beis Hamikdash is going to be built. Bekama mekaymes nemar shamigdash hashlishi banoi u'mishuchlal hu yigala v'yava mishamayim. In a number of places, it says that the mikdash will be built and it will be perfected and it will be revealed from heaven. In other places, it says Rambam, and the Rambam paskins shemashiach b'nei mikdash, that's one of the tasks that Mashiach is tasked with. So the Rebbe says Adaber Charli b'shnei efanim and al begeula. It depends on one of these two paradigms of how the geula can come about. Im zachu, if Bnei Yisrael are deserving, azeh yigala v'yaveh mishamayim. Then Mashiach is going to come from heaven. The Beis Hamikdash is going to come from heaven. Masha Enkein im lo yizachu. But in contradistinction, if not, Chas v'shalom yehabini b'dei Adam al yidei Mashiach. Then it's going to happen through Mashiach. So now the Rebbe says, Umasha b'sefer hayad sefer halachis pasuk harambam shelo yeh bittul davar minhagei shel olam. But in his sefer halachis, the Rambam says it's all going to be natural. Harei zeh mipnei she'eini Mashiach u'v'yasei v'hageula bechlal hu halacha. Okay, look what the Rebbe does here. He says the reason why the Rambam says it's all going to be natural is not because Chalila he wants to say that Bnei Yisrael are not going to be Zeicha, but rather because, after all, he is writing in a Sefer Halacha, Halacha Brura Upsuka. Because when you write halachas, you have to write it clear, and you have to pass in a certain way. V'chein tzarech liyaz gam oifen hagula. Shelo yeh tolei ba'oifen demaisa b'nei Adam. So geula, like every other halacha, has to be a psak, and it can't be determined by the actions of people. Masha enkein hagula ba'ofen da'aru emanane shmaya ukiyetze b'zeh hatluya b'kach sheyu Yisrael b'matzav shel zachu she'enoi baru pasuk ki hakol b'dei shemayim chutz mi'yer shemayim v'harishus l'chol adam nisuna chulei. So it's not that the Rambam doesn't Chalila want to say that it's going to happen in a way of zachu. It's just that in a sefer halachas, the Rambam can't do that because that's dependent on people. People have volition. People have choice. Hakol b'dei shemayim chutz mi'yer shemayim. This is based on our yer shemayim, so he can't paskin that it's going to be in a place of zachu. V'lachein mitar Rambam segula ba'ifin shu halacha. Davar hamufrach liyeh she'ena talui b'matzavam shel Yisrael, and therefore he paskins in a way that's the default that has to be, but he's not obviating the possibility that it will be zachu. But in halacha, he can't paskin something that can only be determined by our choices. Yudches. But to understand this more deeply, the fact that the Rambam describes the Geula in a way that will be natural, אלא מפני שהרמב"ם מפרש שמה שאמרו חז"ל שבמצב של זוכו יהיו כמה וכמה עילויים והנהגה ניסס וכולי, זהו עניין נוסף על עצם גדרי של משיח. Okay? In this Sif, the Rebbe is saying, in the previous Sif, the Rebbe said that it's a Sefer Halacha, so the Rambam is limited to paskening what must be and not something that's dependent on choices that people will make. Here, the Rebbe is saying, on a deeper level, the fact that the Rambam is explaining not in a way of zachu is because the Rambam is mefarish that what Chazal taught about a matzav of zachu that we're all going to be deserving, and therefore there's going to be all kinds of spectacular iluyim, elevated things that are going to happen, miraculous things are going to happen, that the Rambam understands as an additional level, as an additional facet on top of what Mashiach's job is. Koloimar, this is to say, mitzad gidra shel Mashiach v'yasai olam kiminhagei nohig. If you want to describe what Mashiach is and how his coming is going to happen, That's going to happen naturally. Kika amor ha'pu'ula shel bias hamashiach bahalacha he she'al yodei tiyash lemus b'kiyam mitzvahs v'halacha shel ta'er davar hakasher ba'ilam hashekim minhagei neik. Because according to halacha, what has to happen? Mashiach has to come. He has to return observance of all mitzvahs and all halachas to completion, and that is dependent on a natural world. Ella. However, shekasher yamdu Yisrael b'matzav nala shel zachu. But if and when be'ezras Hashem, we will all be in a state of zachu, yavoy inyan noisaf. There's going to be an additional aspect. Sheyaz HaKadosh Baruch Hu nisim v'chulei lahares es toisefes hachavivus v'hamaylo shel Yisrael. Hashem will perform all kinds of miracles to show in a very extra special way his endearment of and the spectacular stature of Bnei Yisrael. And this is the way to also understand the reconciliation of how the Beis Hamikdash will come to be. HaPerish Bazehu. So the explanation now based on what the Rebbe rolled out in Sif Yud Cheshu. Lo yisha nemar sheigala b'yavim mishamayim hu bestir lekach shemashiach b'nei mikdash. That it's not a contradiction. Either it's going to be revealed from heaven, or Mashiach's going to have to build it. Elo shemitzad geder halacha. That again, mitzad halacha, the default, binyan beis hamikdash hu chiyuv mitzvah al Yisrael. K'moshe nemar v'asu li mikdash. The halachic imperative is that Bnei Yisrael shall build a mikdash. V'lachein pasuk haRambam shemelech haMashiach shal yadei chayzun kol haMishpatim b'yamav kashayu mikodim u'meinin melech v'achar kach b'nei beis hamikdash. And therefore, the Rambam paskin, the Melech haMashiach, through whom all of the Torah and mitzvahs will be returned to the way it was. They will appoint a king, and afterwards, or he will be appointed as king, and afterwards he will build a Beis Hamikdash. And he will, practically speaking, fulfill the mitzvah of building Beis Hamikdash. Now listen to what the Rebbe says. But if Bnei Yisrael are going to be in a situation of zachu, this is going to affect something additional. What's going to happen? That within the mikdash that Mashiach will build, yavoy v'yislabesh mikdash delamayla yavoy v'yigala mishamayim. The mikdash from above will be vested in the mikdash of below that Mashiach builds. Please don't ask me to explain what that's going to look like. I am looking forward to seeing it with all of us. Your test. And now the Rebbe answers this question: what forces us? What is the imperative for there to be a second tkufa? Because once Mashiach comes, in whichever way this will happen, because nobody will be oppressing us and nobody will be disturbing us, because our disturbers and our oppressors did not allow us to learn Torah properly, to do mitzvahs properly, but that's going to go bye-bye. On the contrary, like the Rebbe cited above, we're all going to be completely available to study Torah. It's not just going to be the Jews. The entire world will be engrossed and involved in learning about Hashem, to the exclusion of all else. And since we'll have a leg up, because we've already been studying about Hashem, we'll be the big scholars. And it's going to be kamayim layamachasim. It's going to be in a way that is so all-pervasive. It's going to be like water covers the waterbed, the ocean bed. And this will be the fruition of a situation called zachu, that we're deserving. And aza yavi hadavar behechrach litkufa hashniya. And this naturally and of necessity segues into the second kufa, the second era. B'yemais Mashiach kufa, in the era of Mashiach, sheba bitul min hagay shel olam. Then all of the paradigms, all of the laws of nature, all of this will go away. Hanhaga hanisis koilal ha'inin hayisoidi koloshna Rambam tchias hamesim. And this will usher in a time of miracles, including the very basic miracle of tchias hamesim. V'lachein, and therefore, b'sefer hayad, in his Mishnah Torah, Shabbat Bir Harambam is Gidra Shel Mashiach v'Yasei Al Pi Halacha. So in his Mishnah Torah, where he is describing the category of Mashiach, the description, the job description of Mashiach as it is in Halacha, his Bir Echia Matzav Ha'olam, he describes how the world will be Bizman Uba'ofen Shel Ofen Kiminhagay Noheg Behetem Linyonei V'Gidrei Shel Mashiach. He describes that the world will comport itself just the way it is today, which conforms with the inyan and the category and the job description of Mashiach, lahalacha. The ilubi geres tchias hamesim, but when he writes that epistle about the resurrection of the dead, haisiv bir b'sefer hayad, he adds an explanation on top of what he said in the Mishnah Torah, asher ein divareinu zeh hechlati, that what he wrote in the Mishnah Torah is not conclusive, is not the final word. Sharei b'mazav shel zachu oid b'yosim b'golus, because if and when Emetz Hashem, we will be in a situation of Zachu, still in Golos, Tia B'Poel Tekef B'Tchilas HaGeula Hanhaga Miyuchedes Milmaila. Then immediately we will, like the Rebbe says, Tan Tzarayin in the Geula will dance into the Geula in a very special way. In Hanhaga Miyuchedes Milmaila, in a celestial way, Hanhaga Shel Bitul Minhaga Shel Olam, in a way that is going to obviate all of the natural ways in which this world worked, and it's going to be like the Rebbe always used to cite these words from the Navi Micha, Eretz Mitzrayim Arenu Nifla'is, and you could see that the word Nifla'is is italicized. That it will be that just as in the days of leaving Mitzrayim, Hashem says, "I will show you wonders," and the Rebbe is learning this to mean that in a state of zachu, we will go into Mashiach Saitin, not olam kiminahag nahig, not in a way that the world will just carry on the way it always was. That's our Chalamite trip for today. I hope everybody had a good time. This is where everybody starts to cry and say that they're hungry, they're starving,